Alright, welcome to a free will review video. We're going to be talking about compatibilism today. Here is the problem of free will. We've got first proposition, there is free will. The second one, freedom and determinism are incompatible, but it also seems like 3, determinism is true, and those can't all be true together. One has to go. The compatibilist solves the problem, the inconsistent triad, by rejecting the second proposition. It's not the case that determinism's truth rules out freedom. And compatibilism can seem like a counterintuitive position, at least at first, and so unlike Van Inwagen, who was trying to take our ordinary intuitions about freedom and determinism and just make them more rigorous and put them into an argument, Ayer has a little more work to do. And the sort of big picture methodology that Ayer is going for here is he's part of a school of analytic philosophy in its early stages, in which people were really concerned with meaning, that is, like linguistic meaning. And so he suggests that the way to build a theory of freedom, and so to discover whether freedom and determinism are compatible, is to look at the ways we ordinarily use the English term freedom. What kinds of actions do we tend to apply that term to? And what kinds of actions, on the other hand, do we tend to call unfree? And he thinks if we can build if we can get a set of specific cases that seem to us to deserve the title free and or unfree, then we can build our theory, our philosophical theory of freedom from there. And here's an important point for him to start with. He says, once we've done this, looked at some comparisons and contrasts of specific cases, what we'll find is that he says, for it is not, I think, causality that freedom is to be contrasted with, but constraint. So in other words, it's not the mere fact that your action is determined or caused that seems to make it unfree, but that it's constrained, which is a specific sort of bad type of causation or determination. And while it is true that being constrained to do an action entails being caused to do it, because constraint is a form of causation, I shall try to show that the converse does not hold. That is, I shall try to show that from the fact that my action is causally determined, it does not necessarily follow that I am constrained to do it. For it is when my action, he goes on to say later, has any cause, not when my action has any cause at all, but when it has a cause of a special sort, that we think it's unfree. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, let's start with the different kinds of cases of constraint he considers. We've got a case of, here's just sort of general categories of ways an action can be constrained and therefore deserving of the title unfree. We've got physical coercion, where an external force threatens you with some kind of violence or potentially death, or it needn't be physical, it can be some kind of some other sort of threat. And then we've got psychological coercion, he also mentions, so the case of a hypnotist or a brainwashing guru, those will count as people who are under their sway are robbed of their ability to make free choices by virtue of being constrained from the outside by another person. But he also is really interested in cases in which there's no person on the outside, either physically coercing or psychologically coercing. Instead, it's just what's going on inside the agent's head. And there he thinks sometimes certain actions we do are caused, so to speak, by things in our own head. But sometimes the things causing our actions are compulsions. And those aren't like external forces outside of us, other people. Those are still in our own head, but they also seem to be constraining in some way. They're bad kinds of causation when it comes to freedom. On the other hand, there is the fourth category, which is in fact not a kind of constraint, but instead a mere kind of causation, which he's going to use as the good case, when I cause something of my own desires and not of a compulsion. So I'm not going to go through the details of the physical coercion and psychological coercion cases. You can read those passages if you want, either in the text or pause the video. Those are pretty straightforward. The more interesting cases are the compulsion cases. And here's what he says. It is not, however, necessary that such constraint should take the form of subservience to another person. A kleptomaniac is not a free agent in respect of his stealing, because he does not go through any process of deciding whether or not to steal. That's one way of describing it. And then he says, or rather, if he does go through such a process, it is irrelevant to his behavior. Whatever he resolved to do, he would steal all the same. And this is what distinguishes him from the ordinary thief. The ordinary thief, by contrast, goes through a process of deciding whether or not to steal, and that affects his behavior, just as the kleptomaniac does. The kleptomaniac may very well decide, I'm going to steal today, and that causes his stealing. But if the ordinary thief had resolved to refrain from stealing, when it comes to the ordinary thief, if he had made up his mind counterfactually to not steal, he would have carried that out. He would have not stolen. He would have walked away. By contrast, the kleptomaniac, if he had made up his mind not to steal, the compulsion would have kicked in and, so to speak, forced him to steal anyway. And so, as we've discussed in class, in the actual world, the way things actually go, the ordinary thief and the kleptomaniac look from the outside exactly the same. So the ordinary thief has a desire to steal, and he maybe deliberates a bit and then decides, I'm going to do it. And then that causes him to steal. Had he decided counterfactually in some possibility to not steal, he wouldn't have stolen. The kleptomaniac in the actual world also wants to steal, and also ends up stealing. But had he decided not to, he would have stolen anyway. And so in this sense, the kleptomaniac's desires and decision making seem to be affecting his behavior in the same way. But when we peer into alternative possibilities in which the kleptomaniac decides something else, what we find is that his behavior remains the same. And so what this means is that it's really the compulsion and not his desires that are pushing around his behavior. For short, we could say that the ordinary thief steals only if he wants to, whereas the kleptomaniac steals whether he wants to or not. So I'm presenting this a little bit differently in the order from the handout, but it doesn't. You can present it in whatever order you want on the exam, as long as it makes sense. But I think that it's worth mentioning here that Ayer has a general account of freedom that he's extracting from those two specific cases, the contrast between the ordinary thief and the kleptomaniac. The ordinary thief, intuitively we judge that he is free and responsible for what he does, whereas the kleptomaniac, we tend to withhold the judgment that he's free or responsible, or at the very least we say he's less free, right? And so this, for Ayer, suggests maybe this is we have here the makings of an account of free will. Maybe in general what's going on is that an individual X does an action A freely at some time T, if and only if three conditions are met. X has got to desire or decide to do A at that time, and X's desiring to do A has got to be what causes X to do A at that time, But most importantly, there's a counterfactual condition has to be met. If X had decided not to do A, then X would not have done A. If that third condition is met, which it is not in the case of the kleptomaniac and is in the case of the ordinary thief, then, so says Ayer, there's freedom. With all of this kind of background in mind, this I think helps us to frame what Ayer's argument for compatibilism is doing. Effectively, what he's doing is bringing that account of freedom, which he thinks like, let's first start with what do we ordinarily think freedom is? We build a theory, and then we can go into the world and find out, is there any such thing? Does anyone actually meet these conditions? We can also ask, now let's assume determinism is true. Would anyone meet these conditions? If so, then determinism and freedom are compatible. And that's what he wants to argue. So here's the first premise of the argument. If determinism is compatible with the AO condition, or the ability to do otherwise, then determinism is compatible with freedom. The second premise is that determinism is indeed compatible with the AO condition, and it follows via modus ponens that determinism is compatible with free will. As a reminder, the AO condition says that X does A freely only if, means that what comes after the only if is a necessary condition. X is capable of doing something other than A. So what's going on with this first premise? If determinism is compatible with the AO condition, then determinism is compatible with freedom. Here's a brief defense of AC1, and here's the idea that Ayer has. The AO condition on freedom, the claim that we're not free unless we can do something other than what we actually do, that condition was at the very center, at the very heart of both Van Inwagen's argument and just the feeling one gets when one thinks of determinism as a threat to freedom. Why is it that when we think everything I do is determined by the distant past and the laws of nature, why does that suggest to us that we can't be free? Well, it's because the assumption that everything I do is causally determined by the distant past and the laws of nature, that assumption seems to threaten my ability to do otherwise. It sure sounds like if that's true, then everything I do is such that I had to do it. Everything I do is such that I couldn't have done anything else. If I go to Wake Forest, that was fated or fixed and determined, so to speak, long before I was born. And so it seems to therefore follow that I had no choice about whether to go to Wake Forest, or I had no ability to do anything other than go to Wake. And because the ability to do otherwise is a necessary condition for freedom, it follows that I don't have free will, if indeed everything I do is determined, as determinism says. Okay, so that's the natural line of reasoning that leads from assuming determinism to there can't be free will. Now let's take that thought and reverse it. Well, what if we found out that the ability to do otherwise actually was compatible with determinism after all? That the line of reasoning we just gave was mistaken in some crucial way. And in fact, I can have the ability to do otherwise even if everything I do is determined. If we really had an account that had that implication, then the main threat to freedom would disappear. I no longer would be worried once I learned that everything I do is determined, because that's perfectly consistent with my having the ability to do otherwise. And so that's perfectly consistent with my having been free when I did what I did. And so it seems like if determinism is compatible with the ability to do otherwise, then determinism must be compatible with free will, because the ability to do otherwise was the main threat. That's the basic idea behind that first premise. The second premise is more controversial and requires a little more involved defense.